Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the City Limits Stand-Up Desk. I'm Jarrett Murphy, very pleased to be joined today by Afua Atta-Mensah, the Executive Director of Community Voices Heard. And while most people in our viewing audience, of course, know it's CVHs, could you talk a little bit about the organization? And you've been there for coming on a year or so, right?
A little less than a year. I think we're at the 9-month mark for me. But Community Voices Heard, this is our 27th year, and founded in the bad old days of the Giuliani administration by 5 women and Paul Getsos, who were just clear that part of their liberation as women on public assistance was to push back against the work experience program, WEP. And we've come from one office and that single issue to growing to be a statewide organization with 5 different locations, with a host of campaigns: affordable housing, a just social safety net, jobs, immigration, popular democracy with participatory budgeting. So really evolved into a power building organization statewide that deals with the myriad of issues that low-income New Yorkers have to deal with.
And how much have changes in, say, East Harlem, one of the main bases of the organization, changes in the neighborhood, the economics of the neighborhood, the demographics, how much have those shaped the agenda of CVH and how it's changed over the years?
Sure. So, changing demographics don't so much change the issues. It maybe crystallizes or sharpens things for people. So in East Harlem, where our New York City office is based, there's been a market change in demographics, not just in East Harlem, but uptown in general. And so for, CVH members, they're just clear that they have to be involved in having conversations about what's happening in their community, having a clear analysis and strategy on how to protect themselves and their families.
So East Harlem is one of many neighborhoods that's in the midst of a conversation about a potential rezoning. There's a proposal on the table. What's CVH's role been in that discussion?
Sure. So, as I said, I came on board in September, and my predecessor, Sandra Udelman, I think had a really great idea, and our members kind of took a brave and I would say visionary step where they decided to get involved in a collaborative with the borough president, the local community board, and the speaker's office to talk about if there's going to be a rezoning, what's a plan, right, that the neighborhood or people, certain segments of the community could look to and would enshrine kind of the best ideals of what could happen, right, like what could go right. So I'd like to say that process, which took a little less than 2 years, right, where literally folks were coming out of their homes, going to meetings, talking, having some real discussions about kind of what's possible, was something that was really interesting, right, and something that I think engaged folks in a different way, and where people hope that they'd be engaged in a meaningful way, right, not something that's patronizing, not where frankly you waste your time for 2 years coming out, right, and so I like to say that part of the process was like classical music, right, like you knew where it was going to go, you knew where the crescendos were. Well, now we in part 2, right, that's a little more my speed, it's a little more jazz, it's improvisational, sometimes there's a punch, and we like to think we throw them. So it's been interesting.
So the process you're referring to that CVH was part of was the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan,
Correct.
Which was a partnership involving the organization, the Speaker's Office, and I think some other stakeholders.
Community board, yes, and the borough president.
Right. Tell me you mentioned your predecessor thinking that if there's going to be a rezoning, we want it to be X, Y, Z. Let's talk about that premise, though. Do you feel as though East Harlem needs a rezoning?
Listen, we have real concerns about a plan that only rezones communities of color, frankly, right? And there were just in this plan, I think, a lot of missed opportunities about what a just rezoning could look like, where it doesn't only kind of rezone people of color and their communities. But I do agree with her general premise, right? Like we deal with the world as it is as we build power, not how we want it. And it's clear that there was a rezoning coming. And again, members of CVH kind of don't have the luxury of sitting out. So if there was an opportunity to shape in a real way what that could look like, I think it behooved people to be a part of that conversation. And so it was something different, right? I mean, East New York, we saw that there was a different stance where most organizations they said no. And I think rightfully, right? Because there's a lot of things that came out of East New York rezoning that people just don't like at all. And I think we took a chance in East Harlem to say that we'll be a part of this initial stage of the process. That doesn't wed us to the plan, right? That initial phase was what could it look like? So the East Harlem neighborhood plan. And so now in this part 2, we're pushing to make sure that whatever rezoning happens has more than a mere resemblance to that East Harlem neighborhood plan.
So there are some groups in the neighborhood, it's obviously a complex neighborhood like all neighborhoods, who still say we just shouldn't rezone. It's too dangerous, there are risks of displacement no matter how you try to structure those. Do you think they're unrealistic? Do you think that that's a side of the argument worth listening to? What do you think by people who are just like, no, we should put on the brakes?
No, I think, of course, there's real reasons to be apprehensive, right? This is not something that people make up in their head. I think people in East Harlem look to their brothers and sisters a little bit west and central Harlem and see kind of what a change in neighborhood could look like and what that means. My only suggestion to those groups is they should build power and stop it, right? There's a difference between being against the plan and building power to stop the plan.
So let's talk about the East Harlem neighborhood plan versus the city's proposal that is now in the formal Mueller process. It's obviously both are complex sets of ideas, but for you, what do you see as the main differences between what you and the speaker in concert with those other partners put on the table versus what the city has proposed?
So I think some of the main differences is one would be issues of permanent affordability, particularly on the city-owned properties, right? And that's just not something that I think is a small detail, right? There's a finite amount of land, we know, right? Things are topsy-turvy in this world, but it hasn't gone that far crazy that there's more land, right?
New land, right? True.
So, and particularly with the city-owned properties, that's where the city and community has the most kind of leeway to ensure that there's real affordability and not this malleable affordability, like I make $100,000 a year and it's affordable to me, right? Like affordability that's tied with the income of the vast majority of residents of East Harlem. And so those were ideals that were really enshrined in the plan that we're disappointed that we haven't seen in the city's plan. Protections for small businesses in the neighborhood, right? It doesn't matter if 20 people can stay if no one can afford to shop there anymore. Local hiring that's built with labor, frankly, right? Avenues for real prosperity and jobs for people in the community are things that were enshrined in that plan. Issues around the public housing and the support that they need, financial contributions, now more than ever with this attack that's coming from the federal government. So, these were things that were highlighted in the plan that we haven't seen in the city's version that's concerning.
Let's talk about density, because the city now has this mechanism, mandatory inclusionary housing, where when you have one of these neighborhood rezonings, developers who take advantage of it are required to include some income-targeted housing. You can call it affordable or not, depending on your disposition. But the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan makes recommendations for density, I believe, that sort of just trigger the MIH requirement, and the city has a different approach. Density is obviously at the heart of this debate citywide. So what do you think the argument is for doing some increase in density, but not as much as the city would like?
I mean, I think a possible argument for increase in density would have to be tied to affordable units, right? And here, our arguments regarding affordability is tied to something concrete, which is the math, right? The average income is less than $30,000 a year. So, for us, our argument has been if there's going to be an increase in density, it has to be tied to units that would probably be deeper than that 40% area median income that was originally thought of for MIH. But also, along the 3rd Avenue, the current proposed density is just totally off scale, right? It would really cast a shadow, I would say, frankly, over the neighborhood. So there has to be conversations about, yes, possible increased density if that's tied to real affordability and affordability that's not permanent. Currently, the conversations around the affordability would be maybe 20 or 30 years. And frankly, that's a blink of an eye, right? And we want to make sure that these properties have long-term affordability, not just for the people who move in now, but we always have to be thinking about down the road, right? Who's going to be able to live there later? So yes, I think there's possibilities there for change in density, increased density, but then the developer has to give something to it.
One of the concerns that underlies this whole conversation is displacement. And the debate is about kind of it's a chicken or the egg debate. Is displacement a reality that's occurring regardless of whether rezone or will rezoning trigger or exacerbate that? What are you seeing on the ground now in your catchment area in East Harlem? Is displacement occurring, and what do you feel is driving it?
Sure. I mean, so we should start with that the city currently has it, there won't be displacement. That's their premise, which is not, it's just not intellectually honest, right? Because there is already displacement based on the changing demographics in the community. And listen, what happens as the value increases, people want to be able to cash in on those individuals who can afford to pay higher rent. That's just what happens in the market. And so folks would, a lot of times landlords would love to have a building where they have people who are paying maybe $2,000 for a studio as opposed to $800 in a studio who've been long term. And so when we think of displacement in that way, you have increased harassment of tenants. You have folks, frankly, hoarding, right, available units because they'll rather wait it out until the neighborhood changes a little bit more. Right, so it's these types of displacement, and then, so that's the secondary displacement, but also displacement of families who've been there a long time because, frankly, their cultural institutions can't continue to stay there. I can't go to the bodega anymore and buy on credit because the bodega is gone. I'm going to the Whole Foods on Lenox Avenue, right? So people will leave because they cannot afford to stay in the area directly because the institutions that they rely on, the cultural institutions, their churches, are those memberships dwindle, and so folks, I think, kind of follow that as well. So there is real displacement that happens around the rezoning. Now, listen, some of this displacement happens anyway because it's New York City and neighborhoods change, right? But the idea here is how do we stem that and how do we have an intellectually honest conversation about ways to mitigate those types of secondary displacements in the context of rezoning.
Do you sense the city is listening? I mean, you mentioned East New York, and it's only been a year since that rezoning was passed, but it feels like there have been changes in how the city is talking about some of these issues, maybe how it's reacting to it. Do you think that's occurring? Is the city absorbing some of the impact and the input it's getting?
I think there's possibilities and times where they have listened, but I'm a believer that people listen when they have to, right?
I mean, the city says that much of its plan is based on the East Harlem neighborhood plan, and you certainly can see some threads from one to the other, right?
You can see some threads, but where the proof is going to be in the pudding is in these public sites that I keep going back to, right? Like that's the area where the city actually, this is their ball game, right? And how they're going to contract that land and who they've already decided to give that to and what that looks like. So that's really going to be where they have the most authority and where they should be. I would say, frankly, they should be in lockstep with the East Harlem neighborhood plan and other investments that they could and should make.
Speaking of public land, and you mentioned ball game, a proposal that's sort of being treated through the Euler process in a parallel fashion to the rezoning is the 111th Street Ballfields proposal, where some of these issues have come up. What do you think of the approach the city has taken there?
So we have some serious concerns, and I hate to sound like a parrot on this, but it's the same issues, right? A true affordability that's matched in the median incomes to folks who live in the community, making those units affordable permanently, right? Not 20 and 30-year clips. And having, we would have preferred that there was a community developer, right? Because these community developers are clear about their mandate. Their mandate is not a profit margin. Their mandate is to really provide affordable housing, and they do it, and they've shown they know how to do it. So we were disappointed and felt that was a missed opportunity.
So last question is, this process that the community board and Euler that we're going through now is occurring as the city is also gearing up for an election, the 2017 elections. And in the case of this rezoning, potential rezoning, Speaker Marc Bussanich will probably be the one casting the deciding vote on it and then will leave office. But there is a race to replace her. I'm wondering, given that candidates who are running now will not vote on a proposal, but will be there to see its implementation if it does occur, what are you hoping to hear from them in terms of the way that they're going to fight for the neighborhood, the priorities they're going to have when it comes to the aftermath, good or bad, of this land use decision?
Sure. I mean, all the candidates in this race really have to be, I think, fully engaged and talk about, one, what their current position is on the plan, and then two, what they're going to do after implementation, right? What is going to be their obligations in regard to ensuring that portions of the plan that benefit the community, and we'll make some assumption that they're going to be those, are enforced. And so they really, can't skirt this issue and have to be straightforward and clear about what their position is on the plan, what they will do to ensure that there is enforcement, and what their vision is, frankly, for East Harlem going forward.
Afua, thanks for coming to the stand-up desk.
Thank you so much.
Let's go sit down.
It's a pleasure staying with you.